All right. Some of you asked for an overview of introductions and conclusions, especially pertaining to this research paper. So we're going to kind of just walk through that tonight in a couple different areas. The first thing I want to point out for you is if you go to our Canvas page right here, and you go down to writing resources, you might remember earlier in the year we walked through some of the key components of an introduction and a conclusion. Those same key components still hold true for the research paper. Don't overblow it. Again, just to make it really simple, the basic things you need for an introduction is that you need to grip the reader, some kind of hook, engage them, draw them into the conversation so that you can lead up to your thesis statement. That's all you're trying to do there. That's your main drive, is basically answer the question, why should your reader care? So that then they want to continue on in the paper. In your conclusion, it's somewhat similar. In the conclusion, what you're trying to do is basically say, hey, you just read this whole thing. You just spent, 30 minutes, whatever it might be, reading through all this material, all this research that I put together for you. This is why it matters in your life, and this is why this was important. Okay, so those are the two basic principles. Now, if you remember back on this writing resources page, down at the bottom, there's this nice area of structure. And it looks like I left some of these out. I should have put some of these sources in here, but maybe I'll do that later. But here, anyway, you have introduction and conclusion. And if you click that preview button, you can kind of see what is available here. And if you remember back, this might give you some nightmares from first semester, but I had you do this where you basically talked about, what's going on here and how it's working, all that kind of stuff. And here are some options for an introduction. This is just going over introductions about how to engage the reader. Most people will choose interesting fact, quote, or anecdote. Humor is pretty tough to do, and be careful because it could set the wrong tone for your paper. If you're talking about physician, the right to die or something along those lines, formerly understood as physician-assisted suicide, this would be a terrible choice, right? It'd be horrible to probably use humor because it just wouldn't match the tone. A declaration can work well, but again, that's somewhat similar to interesting fact. An illustration is often similar to anecdote. So these top three are really what you're probably going to go with. And remember, the basic function, the things you have to do, the things that I'll be kind of just gauging you on is, do you set necessary context? And remember, you have some narration paragraphs to do that also, so you don't have to set everything in that intro. Do you engage the reader? Are they interested? And do you establish the primary argument? And all that is your thesis. So let's take a quick look at one example that I pulled up. We'll look at it for the introduction and conclusion. And that example is, I think from 2 years ago, from this research paper. And I'll just kind of go through what's working well and what things I probably noted in the paper and I've also noted to you. So the first thing that should stand out is you don't want to start with a naked quote like this, okay? But having said that, this would be really easily fixable, right? All you would need to do is set this context before the quote, okay? And you can maybe set the whole sentence there, okay? And just set that before the quote. And people ask, well, why? Why not just set it up with this quote right away? Because it's somewhat gripping and, it gets the reader engaged. And while that's true, my argument for that, and I think it's the right argument, is that it can disorient the reader. As soon as you start with a quote here, it's clearly not the writer speaking. And so my question as the reader is, who's talking? What voice should be in my head? As soon as I understand that, it's this father who's writing after the death of his young daughter, that takes on a real different tone than if this is just, a writer for the New York Times, which is going to be much more removed. And so when you read through this, in an hour she was unconscious, in 12 hours she was dead. The measles had turned into a terrible thing called measles encephalitis, and there was nothing the doctors could do to save her. That was 24 years ago in 1962. But even now, if a child with measles happens to develop the same deadly reaction from measles as Olivia did, there would still be nothing the doctors could do to help her. Then it goes on and again establishes this context. So a great quote, certainly wakes you up and says like, wow, this is intense. And now what the writer does here that's really good is they go from this historical example that was illustrating how horrific measles was back in the day, and they say today, by saying although, today, vaccine preventable diseases rarely make large comebacks, particularly in today's society. Increasing support for the anti-vaccine movement increases the chance of disease resurgence. So this nicely transitions from this historical example that, again, is gripping, and then sets it into today. And sets up essentially why this argument exists. Because otherwise, most people would say, yeah, we should vaccinate people. That makes a lot of sense. You know, herd immunization, let's do it. But this writer is trying to say, hey, there's a movement, there's a group of people who are saying we don't need these. And she, in this case, is trying to say, don't forget our past and don't forget why we have vaccines in the first place. So really well done. And then if you continue on here, while many avoid immunization as a result of philosophical belief systems against vaccination or misplaced concern for the well-being of the child, uninoculated populations pose risks within the general community, not only to the untreated individual, but also to those unable to immunize. Therefore, governments should enforce the right to inoculate general, even unwilling populations in order to protect the majority. So here she starts into the argument, and right above it, she sets some further context. Despite the personal freedoms violated by forced inoculation, governments should require immunization as a result of both the risks unvaccinated individuals pose to society and lack of evidence substantiating the negative side effects of antigenic material. So nice thesis. It leads into it. It doesn't feel like it jumps suddenly into that thesis. And that's your goal. And that's the harder part of a introduction, right? You should be able to do this where you get a hook, you set context, and then you get to a thesis. The challenge that you have is, okay, how do you bridge these? How do you move from that interesting opening to that thesis? And here the writer does a nice job by bringing us from the past to the present and then saying what's at stake. Why does the reader care? And this is ultimately why the reader cares, and then what should be done about it. So great example of an introduction here. You can pause your screen if you want to read through it again and certainly see that. But I'm going to move on now to conclusions. And again, if you go back to this page on our Canvas page and you look at this concluding overview and practice version 2016 AP language, if you show that preview here, I don't know about you, but I really miss that panda bear. All right. Again, what it comes down to here is, the basis here. A conclusion must do the following things. Cohere with the essay. It shouldn't feel out of place, and it should utilize a concluding strategy. A conclusion can reconnect with opening anecdotes and illustrations. So in that introduction we just looked at, the conclusion could link back to that historical example. The problem with that would probably be that, that person was lamenting the loss of his daughter, and there was no, follow-up to that anecdote. There's no kind of, suddenly the daughter's alive and all's good because she took vaccines. That wouldn't really work in this case. But ultimately, it should answer this question of why should your reader have cared? Why did they read through this whole essay? You can use some of these different strategies, and I will be expecting you to use one of these strategies. So let's take a look at that example paper that we just saw for the introduction. In that example paper, if we scroll all the way to the bottom, not too far. Oop, went too far. Okay. You'll notice, if you paused this and read through it, you'll notice that it doesn't repeat that opening anecdote. That's totally fine. What it does, though, which is really smart, is it basically says, this is why you need to be vaccinated today. This is what's happening. So let's take a look. Although many members of the anti-vaccine movement fear the possible side effects claiming relation to typical vaccination tracks, scientific evidence consistently proves that inoculation presents few negative consequences. Great. So establishes essentially the thesis, but not by stating the thesis, right? And it doesn't talk about how governments must mandate this. It's just saying arguments to the contrary about vaccines are unfounded, scientifically. And I've showed that hopefully through the whole paper. And then down here, you see some connecting language, but ultimately it gets down to this, again, time transition. Recently, for example, measles made a crushing comeback on the West Coast, specifically Disneyland, and then a citation there. As argued by Adam Nuguri and Abby Goodnow, reporters for the New York Times, although there exists a widely available vaccination for this disease, decreased immunization rates effectively lowered collective immunity, allowing the West Coast infection and other possible outbreaks to occur. While controversial issues arise around both the safety and policy surrounding vaccinations, ultimately, mass inoculation protects the general population from disease outbreak and presents few adverse medical reactions. Thus, governments should reserve the right to require vaccination in order to protect the collective health of society. So again, restates that ultimate point here, establishes a nice job of nodding, as always, to this counter argument and to saying, I understand that's out there, but it's dysfunctional, and I don't agree with that point. And it's a really good use of connecting back here to the intro in a very subtle way by talking about how it's measles again. If you remember back at that introduction, that one was also about measles. Okay, so subtle things like that, when you can't necessarily connect the anecdote, maybe from the intro to the conclusion, can work really well. So talking about measles twice adds coherence to that overall essay. So those are some strategies. Those handouts, be sure to go back to if you need help with those. Again, you can look at this as a nice example. Again, just pause your screen. You can read through those or look to that conclusion as an example. Hope that helps. Good luck on your intros and conclusions. And we'll see you in class this week.